There's a really important food source strategy when it comes to whitetails. Whitetail habitat management, whitetail hunting, herd management really boils down to there's three distinctly different food source types that I'd like you to focus on and consider about the food sources you have on your own land. Deer are rhythmic pattern feeders. What that means is they feed like babies. Babies feed, human babies feed when they're young, every hour, 2 hours, that keeps growing as they grow. But they feed that on a pattern every single day, 24-hour period. And deer are no different. They feed 5 times in a 24-hour period. That means 2 times in one food source type, which is their daytime browse, that's back in their bedding areas. They feed once in their afternoon food source, and then they feed twice at night. Where I'm standing right here is a great example of a nighttime feeding source. We have a road right here. Not a lot of traffic on this little hidden road here in southwest Wisconsin, but we have a house right there, a house right there, so there's a lot of yard activity. And then we have the highway right up here that goes by. So lots of activity here, and you can see the highway up here is very steep and rocky, so the deer are very rarely coming down from this location. You can see behind me in the hills, there's a lot of locations that a deer can hide and stay during the daytime in their daytime browse areas. There's some hidden food plots behind the ridge, about 200 yards behind me, and 250 and 300 yards. That represents that afternoon food source. And then by the time you get after dark and you're getting into that 2-3 hours after dark and middle of the night, this represents that nighttime feeding location that deer generally aren't going to be caught in during the daylight hours. How that affects your land and your private land that you're looking at and your food plots specifically. What I find is, obviously daytime browse. Deer need daytime browse in their bedding areas. They need to be able to stand up at mid to late morning, snack a little bit, stand up in early afternoon, move around a few acres and feed on some browse. Maybe you have some acorns in there, a couple random apple trees, but really woody browse, early successional growth, hardwood regeneration, all great sources of browse that is certainly adequate for deer during the daytime hours. But then those deer, they're feeding on woody debris all day. They can't wait to hit that afternoon food source. That afternoon food source they like to hit, what I find is if you have highly defined food plots, deer will feed on those food sources, maybe a hidden ag field, corner of an ag field somewhere. They'll feed on those about an hour before dark, hour and a half before dark, every single afternoon if you let them. And what I mean by that is, do you really have an afternoon food source on your property? A lot of food plots I go to, and I would guess a high percentage of the food plots in the country, hunters overpressure, and it turns those food plots into one of the nighttime feeding slots. Very few parcels actually have afternoon feeding slots that feed deer an hour to 2 hours before dark every single night. A large percentage of the properties, hunting properties, fall into those nighttime feedings. So they're feeding those twice during the night, which is a place like this, might be an overhunted food plot, overpressured food plot, but they become nighttime feedings. What you want on your land is that afternoon daylight feeding. Now even the daytime browse, you can see all these hills around here represent hundreds of acres, if not a couple thousand. And even if a whitetail herd is bedded on the neighbors in a new fresh clear cut, but you own that afternoon food source, what I find is during the hunting season, that if that neighborly pressure, if there's hunting pressure on your neighbors, those deer will just shrink their movement to the afternoon food source. They'll still hit those food sources an hour and a half to 2 hours before dark, if you let them, if you don't pressure them. And that's one of the most important components of whitetail hunting, whitetail herd management, whitetail habitat management. If you own that afternoon food source movement, if you're feeding those deer on your food plots, on your land, corner of an ag field every single day of the season, and you keep those food sources diverse, and you keep that diversity and an adequate amount of food the entire hunting season, you own the deer movement in the area, because not very many people have that afternoon food source. So think about that. 3 different types of food source. You have daytime browse, important. Not necessarily that you have to have it on your land, but it has to be close because you're housing those deer during the daytime. Nighttime food sources. Everyone has nighttime food sources. A lot of people do anyways. That's where deer feel comfortable. They can feed out in these open fields all night. They're not pressured. They're of course not hunter pressured. If they're in a hidden quarter here, we're not getting any poaching back here, anything like that. They have their free run of the mill lazy social time all night. Really try to focus on that third and most important feeding time. That's that afternoon food source. You need hidden, unpressured food sources, food plots, big apple orchard, combination of diversity that you can actually attract those deer every day of the season. You keep that going. That's something that I can guarantee not very many of your neighbors have unless they completely leave their property alone. Very important to think about which one of those three food sources you have on your land, how the deer are relating to those food sources on a daily basis. Hey, let's face it, if they're not feeding on your property that hour and a half, 2 hours before dark every day, they're definitely feeding somewhere else, because that's one of their most important, and that probably is the most important feeding slot out of those 5 feeding times in a 24-hour period, as those whitetails are rhythmic pattern feeders. You own that afternoon food source movement. You own that movement all hunting season long, and watch out. You're the one that dictates the herd and the hunting quality and opportunity in the entire neighborhood, and that's what I urge you to try for. Think about that, where your food sources slot in, and that afternoon food source, if you can hit that 1 out of 5, that's all you need.